Welcome to World Builders Anonymous. Kick that world building addiction and actually finish that novel with your hosts Vito and John.
Cool.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. It's like, hey, you haven't played the new God of War, have you?
I played some of it.
You did?
Boy.
When?
I got it when you did.
Oh, that's right. You just played some of it? How can you not play that whole game?
It got really repetitive.
What? But the story is so good.
I just got so bored fighting another giant ice troll thing that took me 20 minutes to kill, and I just didn't want to deal with it anymore.
I mean, parts of it are a little grindy, but I found it enjoyable.
And I'm like, oh, I just can't wait till I find a set piece thing with a new item that will give me an upgrade for my axe that I can't actually upgrade unless the game tells me I can.
I found the set pieces in the story very compelling. That was,
the set pieces were really cool.
But yeah.
But the actual gameplay just got kind of... You just keep hitting things with your axe until I die.
I've no desire to go back to it now that I've completed the story, whereas I ended up getting the new Red Dead Redemption 2, like I told you.
Here's the thing.
That I can imagine just like playing around in the world after the story.
I still need to look into that. But the thing for me is that from when I started playing it, the first scene of the whole thing was the most compelling to me. Like when you...
Oh, yeah, it's such a great
are chopping down a
opening,
tree with your boy, and then you go, and it turns out you're building
boy.
the funeral pyre for your dead wife, and the music is swelling in such a great way. I'm like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And it never quite hit that level for me again.
I see what you mean. I get that. I do agree. The story wasn't as strong as something like The Witcher 3 or now Red Dead Redemption 2. The story is just awesome.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, and the character development is just top notch, like the best of any game I've ever played.
Oh, wow.
I mean, up there with The Witcher 3 quality in terms of character and story. You just do these little side missions with your camp mates, I guess. And when you go back to your camp after a mission, like it's nighttime now, they're all going to be like doing their own little random things. They might be sitting around the campfire telling stories, or one of them might be playing the guitar and singing, and you can talk to them about what they did today. And it's just so immersive. It's crazy.
That's cool. I need to look into it.
Yeah, definitely. It's my... I don't want to say The Witcher has been displaced as my favorite game, because that's pretty darn lofty to say, but it's definitely up there, right alongside it.
Yeah, I think I would like it more than I like God of War, just because it seems like it has some more varied gameplay.
Yeah, I get that.
The God of War was like a linear. You go here and fight things with your axe, and then they're gonna die, and then you go on.
Yeah, God of War is like the pinnacle of that sort of linear style of gameplay, I think.
Yeah.
With some exploration elements, but it's still pretty linear. But yeah, I definitely prefer this sort of thing with like the more open world, do whatever you want. If you do that well, you can't really beat it. Yeah,
I feel like the more ways you can play it, it seems like that kind of been when it becomes a little more fun for me. When I can kind of, I'm tired of hitting things with my axe. Maybe I can pull out a bow and do this. No, you have to use your axe.
Like in Red Dead, you can go fishing, you can go hunting, you can play poker, you can go to the local.
You can do the laundry.
You can do laundry. You go grab a whiskey at your local tavern, get in a bar fight. Whatever you want.
You can do your taxes.
No, we're outlaws. We don't do taxes. What are you talking about?
Right.
Speaking of which, anyway, yes. Anyway, here we go. Oh, yeah. Welcome to World Builders Anonymous.
Oh, my gosh. You did it this time.
I did it this time, and it's actually a beer this time. So give me a second. Here we go.
Oh, gosh.
Nice.
What's frustrating to me about that is before we started recording, is like, you're going to really love my intro this time. It's going to be great.
You didn't love that?
I feel underwhelmed, to be honest. I feel like I'm missing some creativity.
I don't know. I felt like it was a good callback, full circle kind of thing,
Well, I'm glad you are satisfied about it.
Plus, I get to drink a beer while I work. Who gets to say they do that? Except for me all the time, because I'm a musician and I play in bars all the time. It's just another day in life.
Moving on.
Anyway. Okay. So Johnny and I were both pretty busy this week. I was in Vegas for a gig and for a couple days. Got back from that, did another series of gigs, and just did my last one of the week yesterday. Now I have somewhat of a lighter week coming up. I'm going to Vegas again, but it's for like 3 days straight. And of course, we only play in the evenings. So hopefully this week I will have a lot more time during the day on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to work on writing and the article and all that kind of fun stuff. But this week we both had kind of a down week in terms of the writing and podcasting thing. So we're kind of going to just have some fun with it today and kind of talk about something we both really like, both really know a lot about, grew up with, and something interesting to incorporate into your world as well, which is religion.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. What were you up to today, this week, John? You went to a wedding last night, is that right?
I was at a wedding for one of Tessa's coworkers last night, and it was a lot of fun. Talked to we can apply this. Talked to a guy who is the husband of someone my wife works with, and he does a lot of as a hobby. He does a lot of work on like arrowheads and
Arrowheads?
He finds arrowheads and like related items like in a sort of archaeological way, and then comes up with new theories of how they were made, and he has his own theory of how certain types of arrowheads were made, and it's fascinating.
Like old arrowheads.
Older arrowheads, yeah. Like he said, he found evidence that the people who made those arrowheads would essentially find a rock with an indentation in it that looks kind of like the shape of an arrowhead, and then they would find a piece of like flint, I guess, or whatever you're making the arrowhead out of, and then place it on that sort of template that's sort of pressed into the rock, and chisel out the shape against that mold, so to speak. And that's how they can make them.
So you have like a hard backing to kind of press against.
It's an indentation, so you're sort of hitting around the indentation in the rock,
right.
And that allows you to make more consistent arrowheads with less wasted material.
Basically a mold, an arrowhead mold.
Essentially a mold for stone, which is a really interesting concept. But anyway, that got me kind of thinking about creative ways to... I haven't read a lot of fantasy stories focused on a very early society or a super primitive one either.
That is an interesting thing, yeah.
But it made me think, like, there's some cool stuff you could do with that if you have some creativity and kind of come up with some of those alternative ways things could have happened. And, this is his theory about how it did happen. So, maybe even there's some reality to it. But yeah, I thought that was really interesting. It was a fun conversation.
Not to get too far down this rabbit hole, but is that actually his job, or is it just like a hobby?
No, he's just something he does on the side. It's something he enjoys doing. He works with like a lot of archaeologists in the area to kind of flesh out the theory of it, and he's kind of one of the only people who's onto this thing. It was fascinating to talk with him about it.
Huh.
But yeah, so I went to a wedding. Generally did work things. I spent the weekend with the in-laws, which was a lot of fun. So I just in general didn't end up with having a lot of time to write, and the time I did have was largely unproductive. It was too, when you don't have a lot of time to sit down and write, you kind of feel pressured to write a lot really quick, and you just can't do it.
Yeah, it's like,
that's kind of how my
get
writing
stuff
went.
done, and you're like in work mode, but you're not. In
I don't know how.
Mode. Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
you need.
I find my.
Yeah, for sure. I need like 4 hours or something to sit down.
Yeah, if I sit down with a couple hours at least to work with and just kind of ease into it and feel it as I'm writing it, then I find I get a whole lot more done than if I sit down with an hour or less and just go, I have to write, I have to get a certain amount done during this period, and then you just get nothing done.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure we can talk in some future episode about like scheduling time for writing and how to go about doing that. I this week, one of the things I did do, I talked to a couple friends of mine who I had forgotten were in the writing world because we've taken a break from writing for a long time before starting this podcast. And I had forgotten I have some friends who actually are writers slash.
Oh, wow.
One is a professor, associate professor or adjunct professor or something like that of creative writing. And then one is a very successful screenwriter and now novelist who I played Dungeons and Dragons with last night for the first time ever. That was super fun. But we should definitely try to get them on the podcast at some point to talk about their method and stuff. But yeah, anyway, so we had somewhat productive weeks, just not with writing itself. So we're going to dive into kind of something we've grown up with and know a bit about, and something that's really interesting to us in stories, especially fantasy, because there's often a magical component of this thing, but it's religion. And let's just give a little bit of background about where we kind of come from with this, if you want to start off with that, John.
Sure. So Vito and I are both raised in Christian household, going to church pretty much all our life, and I think it's fair to say very much so that we're still in that same place.
Yep.
No shame about that whatsoever. But and I think it kind of gives us some perspective on ways you can take religion going into fantasy, because there's a certain there's something in literature that frustrates me, and I think you probably feel the same way about
just
this.
the one thing, though.
No, only one thing. Ever. I love everything else. No. But you'll find so often in books and in TV shows in particular, in movies, that there's like a facsimile. If it's a fantasy story, there's a facsimile of Christianity.
Yeah.
And if it's in a TV show or movie, often it is Christianity itself, just grabbing it. And it's portrayed like there's one crazy person who really believes in it, and they're insane. Like they act like no one should ever act, and everyone else in the story goes, "Ho hum! Look at that naive old style Christian who doesn't actually understand anything about the way the world works. For shame on them."
Stephen King does that a lot.
Yeah, and there are certainly places where Christians as a whole can be criticized. I mean, absolutely. I think the closer you are to it, the more you can see that, but it's easy to make a straw man and kind of poke fun at it in literature. And one thing we should seek to do as world builders is not to do that about anything, not to take anything that exists in the real world and kind of, we think we're so clever, like, oh, it looks like it's this, but actually I'm making a real world analogy, like parallel and analogy and making a really groundbreaking point. You're probably not.
It's probably pretty transparent, yeah.
And that's true whether you're trying to talk about Christianity, whether you're trying to talk about socialism, or trying to talk about anything that you think you can really make a statement about. And that's one thing we can talk about today is making sure in our writing and in our world building we represent things well, I guess, and don't go too far in trying to make a point.
Well, I mean, it's fine to make a point, but it needs to feel well balanced. It needs to feel like you really understand what you're talking about, and that you're not just presenting one side of something, which again, it does often feel like, from our perspective, watching a lot of, especially film, especially Hollywood type stuff. I've not read as many fantasy stories that feel like that, but some certainly do. But yeah, there's like the one character who's like the crazy, religious nut who's just like, believes the world's about to end, and that's the only portrayal of religion.
Or is like super judgmental and
yeah.
Although I will say for sure, a lot of Christian movies. Oh, I wouldn't say a lot. I'm sure that's probably true, but I haven't seen that many of them. But they can definitely go the other way.
Oh my gosh,
Christian
yes.
movies will like straw man atheism like you wouldn't believe.
Oh my gosh, yes, that's definitely the case. Holy crap. I mean, that's Christian movies in general tend to not be good because they do exactly this, because they're based around the religious aspect, and they do exactly that in the opposite direction so often. Yeah.
They made a few decent ones lately, which has been really nice. They're at their best when they focus on like just the story and just tell a story, and don't try to paint any kind of pictures that aren't accurate, I guess. But
the band For King and Country, who I actually played with almost a couple years ago now, in Anaheim, they made a movie last year, I think, called Priceless, which is probably my favorite like Christian quote unquote movie
that was a really
I've
good
ever
one,
seen. It had a few moments of that where it was like, oh, this is the moment where the old mentor character delivers the message about forgiveness and all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, it was kind of like it could have been like almost like a John Wick movie or something like that.
Oh yeah,
not to the same extent, of course, as John Wick, but for that type of movie, that was the best one I've seen, I think. But anyway, in fantasy fiction in particular, I don't remember a lot of stories in which religion plays a huge role for the main character. Like, I don't remember a lot of stories in which the main character really ascribes to a particular religion, and it's a significant part of their character.
I can think of a couple examples. It's not Blood Song. That's the first book in the series, but the second or third book, maybe either I might be misremembering the titles, but they're books by Anthony Ryan. You can look them up. Either in there's Tower Lord, maybe Raven Shadow, and Queen of Fire are like the other ones in the series. But in one of them, one of the main characters, whose name escapes me at the moment, is a super, super like hardcore devotee of this offshoot religion that's seen as like savagery by the cultured people. But she has been totally indoctrinated, and it's portrayed sort of it's definitely portrayed as a negative. Like she was raised by this sort of teacher who beat her mercilessly if she didn't like recite passages perfectly and all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't a shot at any particular religion that I could tell.
Sounds kind of like the Mordsith from Terry Brooks or Terry Goodkind.
It is a lot like that, yeah. By the way, Terry Goodkind, brutal books. My gosh.
Oh my gosh, gee whiz.
I remember reading like a review of one of his books as I was reading them, and basically it said you have to understand that Terry Goodkind loves to torture his main characters horribly. It's his favorite thing. So if you're not okay with that, don't read this book.
Oh
but
my
anyway,
gosh. Anyway, yes.
Oh, some of the crap that those characters went through is awful. But I feel so bad for them. But yeah. And the way it was sort of portrayed in there is that she was raised to be this fanatic follower of this cult, essentially, and grew up to be an assassin and do something. And not to spoil too much, but I think it's not very much of a spoiler to say that she kind of finds her way once she, gets on her own in the world. She kind of learns, to ignore all that, which is kind of weird because I feel like it should be a lot harder to break something like that. The holds that these religious cults tend to foster on someone after, it's all for 20 years shouldn't be easily broken in the course of like a month.
Well, that's kind of that's where the storytelling itself comes in, because that does happen, and that's what good stories are made of, but you have to like portray it in a convincing manner, of course, and
right.
Actually earn that turn for the character through the events that actually happen. You can't just have it be like, oh, I see the light now. I was totally wrong.
Oh,
okay.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. A more common theme, though, that I see in fantasy literature in particular is more so than a character who is a very strict follower of a certain religion, is a character who questions everything and doesn't have a particular place. Aragon kind of falls in there. He asks the elves, do you have any gods? They're like, no, we don't really have any gods. He asks the dwarves, and like, oh, the dwarves have gods, and the humans have their own gods too, and he doesn't really know what's true.
But it's kind of like, I guess we do. It's not really a big deal or anything, but
No, in that world it isn't really. And
it doesn't have to be in every single book, of
course. No, not at all. It is kind of a stereotype a little bit, I think, that the main character is like
this
sort of above religion,
exactly,
almost.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I don't believe in all that nonsense, when most of the people across history have had something they believe in.
Right, especially in the time periods in which fantasy books usually take place.
Yeah.
Like, you're usually a lot more mystical, especially if there's literal magic in your world.
Which is a great point, too, because, one thing that some religions ended up getting based on a long time ago is people who could seemingly do something incredible.
Right, exactly.
And ascribe that power to some source, and that becomes their religion. When that's actually a thing, then you would think that some religions would be very believable and crop up from that sort of thing.
You think that'd be much more common trope in fantasy?
You really would.
Attribute this magic that people, can, literally
Oh, it's just
wield.
The way things are.
It's just the way the world is, I guess.
So why can't everyone do it?
Right, yeah. And you could have like different religions competing to like explain
Absolutely.
why this happens. And of
Absolutely.
course that does happen in some books, but it's very rare. I mean, I'm not the most well-read person in the world, but it's very rare that I've actually seen that idea explored a whole lot. But it seems pretty like a pretty clear thing that would happen in that sort of world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially as different cultures rise up. But if magic is this universal thing, that they would all come up with some explanation about why it's there, not just like, well, I tap into the the energy that's in every living thing in the world, like the force or something.
Yeah. One thing I do like, another way to kind of roll that, in the Lives of Locke Lamora, there's magic, and I love the way that Scott Lynch did this. Essentially, this is sort of a tangent, but I think it's worth it. Oh, excuse me. Basically, there are people who are born with magic, but a group of the most powerful magic people at some point got together and said, you know what? If we can somehow form a monopoly on magic, we can make a ton of money. And so they started, anytime they'd hear like any story about a kid or a person with any magical ability, they would go to them and say, hey, you can join our magic group or we're going to kill you. And
That's quite a monopoly you have there.
Right. Over the course of time, they became the only ones who could use magic. And if you found out you could use magic, you either went and joined them immediately or you never talked about it.
Is there no recourse in this world? Like nobody going like, hey, you can't do that.
Who's going to fight them?
I mean, is magic like so powerful where they just basically...
If the magic people are essentially unstoppable.
Okay, I see.
Like if they wanted to take over the world, they could. And the only reason they don't is because there's no benefit to them for it because they already have everything they could possibly want.
Right, yeah.
And so they kind of have their own community. And I might be making this up, but I don't think I am. In the story, I think at some point the question of religion comes up, and they're basically like, "Why would we believe in anything? We're like the all-powerful
like
beings of this
we
world.
are gods, essentially."
Yeah, like why would we have any faith in anything? Because we're the be-all end-all of the world.
Interesting.
And that's a cool idea as well. That's what I'm getting at. You know, a person can think, "Oh, I have this. I can throw fireballs out of my hands." They can either ascribe that to something and actually think, "Oh, there's some higher being who gives me the power to do this," or they can pretend it and gain power for themselves by saying, "Oh, I am the representative of the sun god who allows me to throw fireballs out of my hands."
Right.
And in so doing, gain notoriety and fame for themselves and sort of become the head of this movement. Or they can say, "I can throw fireballs out of my hand. I'm the best. There's nothing above me."
Yeah, totally. And you have to imagine the history of your world, too, because religion comes from a very primal place, I think, at least in terms of most of the, legends surrounding it and the traditions that are passed on, usually. Like, you have to imagine the first, sort of caveman in your world who discovered that he could, like, create fire from his fingers or do whatever power is possible in this world. The first person who discovered this power and what they would have attributed it to. Like, if you can cast fireballs out of your hands and you're this tribal kind of hunter-gatherer society type person, and you look up at the sun, this big fireball in the sky, and you look at the fire you can create from your hands, you might ascribe that to the sun god or something. I don't know.
Right.
And that is going to be passed on and might create eventually some sort of organized religion surrounding fire magic and ascribing it to the sun and whatever god controls the sun. I don't know. There could be a pantheon.
Yeah.
There could be all kinds of different things. You could have offshoots of that group, all sorts of things.
Well, think about even, without, obviously in our world, the ability to do those things, we still ascribe, like the Romans, for example, had the god of the sea and they had the god of the sun and they had, the gods over these particular areas. And they did that without even them having, niche abilities for one, like the different people having these niche abilities. If you had people with those abilities, if you had someone who can control lightning, control water, control fire, or what have you, it'd be very easy to segment things and say, "Oh, you are the representative of this thing. You're the representative of this thing."
Yeah.
And divide culture on very specific lines in that regard and sort of form
this priest caste maybe or something.
Yeah, and it'd be cool. I don't think I've seen this that much in worlds where there are varying magical powers. Some worlds like Harry Potter have it where, every person is equally capable of any form of magic essentially. But if you have it to where a specific person can only do a specific set of things, it seems like a natural next step to think that culture and society would sort of separate themselves on those lines and devote themselves to one area based on the people who can use magic would obviously go with what they can do. And then people who didn't have magic powers would gravitate towards one or the other. And you could create these really interesting cultural lines and sort of segmented societies based around this. And, they would compete and and sort of jockey for power. But I haven't really seen that kind of thing that much.
Totally, yeah. And you have to remember, too, like in our world, even, back in the day, the Romans and the Greeks and the people with the pantheons, they did believe in magic. They thought that, the storm that came in was some sort of, they didn't know why weather happened. They didn't understand, like, I don't even understand weather.
It's still magic to me.
It's all magic to me. But even more so for them, that was magic for them. And that's exactly what they attributed to the gods. Were these forces beyond their control, and they I think there were times in history where people believed that certain other people, even if it was just like somebody they'd heard of and never actually seen, had these sort of divine powers, and that's something people definitely believed in at some point. And so you can definitely take some influence from that if in your world there are these literal magic powers that are well known and well defined.
Yeah.
And like you said, it does depend on like who can use it, what are their specific powers, how delineated is it between different people having different powers? Is it just some general thing that everyone can tap into if they have enough concentration or whatever? There's a lot of factors that go into it, but it can be a really interesting cultural element. In my story in particular that I'm working on, I'm definitely incorporating some sort of religious aspect into it. In my previous idea, I had I think I've mentioned before, like this Avatar-like magic system that I didn't realize was from Avatar because I'd never seen Avatar. And I unintentionally kind of ripped it off. I kind of modified that and incorporated this religious element into it, in which there's these elemental kind of, they're not actual schools, but like, kind of different practices of magic. There's like the water and the fire and all that kind of stuff, roughly delineated, and not everyone has the same powers even within those camps. But there's definitely, within different countries, within different cultures, different kind of priestly castes that attribute to those powers to different things. In particular, it definitely plays into the political struggle between the islanders in my main kind of land, where my main characters come from, this island that's based on Sicily, and the people who come from, my world's version of France, because my whole story is based on the Sicilian Vespers in the 13th century, between France and Sicily, and they have different religious ideas about the use of magic, the proper use of magic, the proper place of magic, control of magic in particular, because governments always kind of get united with religious elements eventually, like the Catholic Church and in the old days in Europe and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And basically in my world, the French, quote unquote, have essentially created like a unified church, in which, all practices have to be kind of bunched into the same umbrella, and you can't have your own individual kind of practice if you're within their empire. And that's a big point of contention with the Sicilians, quote unquote, again, because they want to keep practicing their sort of brand of this magic-based religion. And so that's, a big part of why this revolt happens. And so you can incorporate those elements big time. And there's a lot of other stuff that can go into it. It doesn't have to just be magic. For my main character, at least one of them, a lot of sort of the moral teachings are a big part of his character, I guess. And that's a big point of contention with his brother, who doesn't believe in those. So that can be an interesting character thing, too.
Yeah. One of the fun aspects about using religion is definitely interplaying it with your characters. And in my world, I don't have it fully developed yet, but I kind of like one aspect of it is that so my main character is one of the practitioners of the magic system of my world, which is centered around essentially these artifacts. And the longer you have one of these artifacts, the stronger your powers grow.
Which I think is brilliant, by the way.
So, well, thank you. The kind of common people, the peasantry, if you will, doesn't have a proper understanding of what all this is, what the magic, how it actually works. Because if they've
never had one,
you can't even really buy these artifacts. They're held by the church,
which is kind of unified with the state.
Right, and basically if the king says, we're going to give one of these artifacts to this person, they kind of have to do it, but you can't just go, oh, I'd like to buy one magic stone, please.
Yeah, right.
But so the people don't really understand how it works. And to them, the ability to do these incredible things, like throw fireballs from your hands, to have a generic example, is something that they can only explain in a sort of religious context, because it doesn't make sense to them. But the main character and anyone else who has one of these understands that it's nothing to do with that. and they might even kind of resent the fact that people think it's religious, and they kind of go, "Oh, bless my child," and he's like, "Oh my gosh,
You guys are so dumb.
yeah, that's not even. I don't want to. I'm not even gonna. He doesn't even want to play along with it because it's not. He just knows it's not real, and he kind of please like, you don't understand. I don't have anything, and they, you know." There's a lot of interesting things you can do with that kind of thing if your main character happens to be able to use powers.
Yeah, definitely. And it's good to build in misconceptions about things like magic and religion into your world.
Because that's what would happen.
Because that's exactly what would happen, exactly. If there's like a wizard class or something, not class, but like a certain subset of people who can use magic in your world, and not everyone has access to it. And especially if not everyone knows somebody who can do magic in any sort of way. If they're like this secluded bunch who kind of keep to themselves, and you know, like in Eliza Lamora, if they like incorporate other magic users into their community, maybe by force, maybe just because no one else understands them or whatever, you know, there's going to be a lot of misconceptions that propagate throughout, you know, legend and folk tales and just word of mouth and you know, he said, she said type stuff that people are going to think regarding what people can or can't do with magic, and that's going to add a lot of flavor and realism to your world. Whereas if everyone's like, "Oh yeah, I know how that works," you know, "Can you just do this for me real quick," or whatever, they know exactly how your magic works. That's going to be like, I don't think you'd actually know what this thing is, you peasant farmer, you.
Right. And from a storytelling and I guess writing perspective, utilizing that can give you a chance to explain your magic to the reader as well. If you have a character, like my character understands how to use magic and understands what it is, but he's going to meet a character at some point in the story who has no idea how that works. And you can use that as a chance to explain your magic to the reader.
And you still don't want to be like, "Oh, well, I take this thing."
Not so heavy-handed.
Yeah, but in sort of subtle ways, at least. It's an
well,
excuse.
1,000 years ago.
Sit down.
Let me
tell you a story.
Yeah. Although that's kind of a convenient segue a little bit. Another really cool aspect to religion and how you can use it is the sort of convergence, if that's a word. That's a word, right?
Yeah.
Of mythology and history. Because so think of it like the Greeks, the Greek, you know, god hero myths. You don't really know to a Greek person at the time what they would have seen as mythology and like, oh, that's just a story, or what they would see as, oh, that happened.
Yeah, totally.
You know, is Hercules actually a son of Zeus, right? Or is he? And you don't really know if it's history to them or if it's understood to be mythology and folklore. And you can build out a history that way that's more fantastic than real life because there's an ambiguity to it. Is it history? Is it mythology? You can kind of dance across that line a little bit when it comes to your world building.
Yeah, totally. And that's always an interesting question. Like, did people actually believe these things back then, or did they understand that they were kind of analogies or parables and that kind of stuff? Or did they think they were actually events that happened? Like, was Hercules actually a person who existed to, you know, a person back in, you know, ancient Greece? Or did they understand that this is just kind of a story, you know?
A cautionary tale kind of about pride.
Yeah, I don't know enough about that period to really know that answer, but that's an interesting question you can ask in your story and build into your world,
definitely.
For sure. In terms of the moral side of a religion, that can introduce a lot of interesting elements. For me, one of my characters, like I said, really believes in the primary religion of the island. And a lot of the moral teachings, you know, like any religion, often revolve around things like, you know, sexual activity or, you know, other, you know, sort of basic moral things like, you know, stealing, that kind of stuff. But things that aren't really culturally the norm sometimes can be interesting to play with. Like one of my characters believes that it's, you know, it's wrong to have sex outside of marriage, and one doesn't, and that's an interesting point of tension between them. And that's not an uncommon element in religious practices.
Not at all.
But it's kind of not a very popular thing in sort of the what's the word? Not layman.
Contemporary.
No, like non-religious culture, I guess.
Oh, you can go with heathen if you want to.
Heathens, yes. No.
Gentiles.
But no, that's an interesting... I've not really read any stories in which like sex is treated as something that's outside of or that is the sacred thing that shouldn't be touched.
Which is weird,
unless it's a person who's saying like, oh, those guys are so dumb for believing that,
Right. Which is odd because that's kind of across history in these time periods we're talking about. That was kind of a very widely held idea.
Yeah, definitely. And is something that's still, widely held in certain sections of society, but it's definitely not in vogue anymore.
No.
But that can make for an interesting, conflict for your character, especially if your reader doesn't quite share that belief, maybe. And you can kind of introduce like an element of like, well, maybe this is an interesting idea. Like maybe there's something to this, instead of it being like this thing that's obviously just stupid and, to be, disdained.
Well, I think that's a consequence of sort of the idea that art in general is supposed to be on sort of the cutting edge of society, and sort of newer ideas would hold contrary to that. Sex is, sacred and all that kind of thing. And that's kind of one reason I think maybe that it's not as highly represented. But I was thinking as well, I think the sort of the stereotype, and certainly for reasons that are grounded in reality, most religions in literature and stuff like that, the invented ones, tend to kind of hold similarly conservative ideas about things like stealing and lying and what have you. And that's certainly the norm, but there are examples to the contrary, even history. It'd be interesting to have a religion that's sort of centered around the idea that, that morals aren't really important. And I don't know exactly what that would look like, but you can kind of use it another way. You don't have to have religion be the super conservative part of society. You can have it be the more wild, crazy, lawless, even
having bacchanalias all the time and crazy parties and stuff.
Exactly, right.
There's a reason though why those are norms, though, like having those moral kind of teachings, because any society that doesn't have those moral teachings and kind of codes that are widely ascribed to, especially when it comes to things like stealing and murder and that kind of stuff, if a society doesn't cling to those norms, that society isn't going to progress very far, because you have to have like secure property rights. You have to have people not killing each other all the time. You have to have, a lot of these things in order to actually have a functional society. And actually, in a weird way, sex, it was one of those things for a long time, especially before contraception was as big of a thing.
Oh, sure.
That was actually a really important element of society, because if you're having a bunch of kids that you didn't plan on, and still is the case, for sure, you're going to have a harder time than someone who's, a little bit more careful and a little bit more choosy, I guess, to use a not the best word, I guess, but that, especially in the old days, especially in the periods we're going to be writing in sort of a fantasy setting, that is more of an important thing in a societal sense, I guess. And so it's something that shouldn't be just dismissed, that is a relic of an older time, because you're in an older time.
Right. And I'm just going to take a second here. Whatever you do, don't ever throw in a contraceptive in your world that is, and the guy eats a plant and bam, contraception. Don't do that. It's so stupid. It makes no sense, and it just entirely eradicates a potentially really interesting idea of people having to actually make decisions. It's. I'm looking at you, Patrick Rothfuss.
Oh my gosh.
That was I love Patrick Rothfuss's books, and that's it.
I also nearly
that one thing just makes me crazy.
I'm so into those books, but I nearly rage quit when I read the section in which this takes place. It's just like, really? This is happening right now? Okay. And it's not just it's a more complicated situation. But
it exists only so he can have thoughtless sex with multiple people.
Yeah, just,
that's the only reason it's there.
Yeah, it's pretty insane.
And it's never mentioned again. It's not a society-changing idea or thing. It's just, oh, by the way, if you chew this thing, you don't make babies. Oh, okay, cool. Let's move on.
Awesome. Never mind.
That changes the fabric of history. What are you talking about? I don't know why I'm so mad about this one thing, but it makes me mad.
It was a weird kind of segment of that book, though, too. It was just like this weird, like, sexual escapade that the character
that
goes
stands on its own for no.
that just came out of nowhere,
I don't
and you're just
know.
like, what's happening right now?
In all respect to Patrick Rothfuss, those books are incredible.
He's an amazing
But
writer, amazing,
It's very weird.
Yes.
That happened.
That was a very strange portion of those books. That second book had that whole section in it. Anyway, yes.
Moving on.
But yes, anyway, the kind of union of magic and religion can be a really interesting thing because we're working with fantasy here. We're working with a situation in which, the supernatural is an inherent part of your story, and really explore that. Really, take that to use that to the largest extent you possibly can. Ouch. Anyway,
What just happened?
Popped myself. Use that to the largest extent you can, and really explore that relationship between what people would have ascribed these magical powers to in your world, to really get the most out of both religion and magic in this fantasy setting.
Right.
Long
I was
story
reading
short.
I was reading a comment from a guy on Reddit on one of my posts up there. And he was working with a sort of less developed society, and one of the things he had in there was that there was culturally available memory. There was a really bad ice age, and this is almost this like cataclysm sort of. What is it? What's the word? I don't know words, but like this really sort of almost society destroying ice age. A while back. And that was the foundation for their religion. Like, the God is this, and he gave us this ice age to punish us for something. And they kind of formed their religion around these natural events that were sort of big and sweeping. And I thought that was pretty interesting. An underdeveloped society, in antiquity, might actually think that, might see this giant event and go, oh, that's the hand of the gods. And build it around that. So you don't, even if there's magic in your world, you don't have to play it specifically around the magic like we've been talking about. You can still do it in other ways, and then just use the magic as sort of a feature of it. Another thing I was thinking just now as well, though, you can also put religion in contrast to magic if you wanted to. You could say, the religion might say this magic is the thing of, like, if you're talking in Christian terms, this magic is the thing of Satan, and it's not for people to really use, and people who do that are demons. Like, you can kind of play it that way a little bit and put magic as a sort of the counter to religion and have them compete against one another in an interesting way.
I guess it depends on how widespread it is, how well known the powers are, like how many people can use it, how well defined are those powers. Like if it's pretty well known that like everyone can like move things with their mind, that's not going to be as much of an issue. But if especially if the powers that kind of occur kind of go counter to the prevailing religion that might come from something else sort of more quote unquote natural in nature, or something more antiquated and from this older tradition, then there's going to be some clashing. And again, you can do that even within people that believe in magic, because you can have different schools of thought in terms of like where the magic came from and who this is the power of our primary deity, like, no, this is the power of our devil like figure, no, it's bad, and they can kind of clash on that between different cultures and religions.
And put people in your world who kind of run the gambit in terms of their level of understanding it. And
it's gamut.
Isn't it's not a B?
Gambit is like a desperate kind of attempt at the last minute to try to succeed.
Oh.
The gamut is like a maze or a labyrinth, or sort of a trial.
The more you know. So run the gamut in terms of like their level of understanding, devotion, and skepticism of the religion. Don't just have the people who are sold on it and the people who are like, oh, that's a bunch of crap. Have the people who like question it, who they understand that they're kind of supposed to believe in it, but don't really know what they think. Have people who are in, but not like all the way in. Have people who question it, but don't really believe in it, but kind of want to a little bit. Like, have people in your story who make your religion feel real by having realistic reactions to it. Not everyone either is all in or totally disbelieving.
And make the people who believe in it very identifiable, because I mean, there's something very...
Yeah, you don't just become a crazy person.
Even if you yourself are an atheist, there's something in religion, obviously, because it's been so common throughout history, that's very human and very identifiable, that it can't just be dismissed. There's something to it that should be kind of explored in your story and within your characters. And also the opposite side is true too. Like, make the people who are disbelieving very identifiable and their reasons for disbelieving identifiable. Don't just make them... If you are yourself a Christian or a religious person, don't make the atheist type characters in your story just these disbelieving idiots, heartless, kind of just, soulless people.
There's no good guy. There shouldn't be like the people who believe in it are good guys, people who don't are bad, or vice versa. People aren't that simple in real life.
Right, yeah. And it's a tough line to straddle, just like anything else.
It's a tough subject to kind of tackle in general, just because...
Yeah, it's like tackling something like, capitalism versus socialism in your story or something like that. People are going to have their own pre-existing kind of biases in those directions, and it's going to be a hard thing to kind of walk the line with. But I think the best stories give credence to both sides of any sort of argument and give you some sort of perspective on the side that you don't fall on, that you didn't have before, even if it, kind of is, leaning in one way or another,
Yeah, that balance is kind of one thing that points to, an author who is really doing his best or her best to portray things well and not just... You can tell when people have a very clear bias towards one side or the other, unless they make a point to not let that shine through in the book. If you don't make a point to not do it, odds are it's going to end up being skewed.
Yeah, and it's okay to have a message, like, to say something like, religion is a valuable thing that shouldn't be dismissed. If that's your point, then that's a good point to make. Just don't do it in a way that demonizes people who believe differently, or whatever the thing is that you're trying to put across.
For sure.
Anyway, I think that's about enough of that for today. I'm sure we'll get a sort of a more specific look at different things with religion at some point in the future. But that's kind of I thought that was a pretty decent general overview of our thoughts on the subject. Not having fully fleshed out our own systems in our own stories yet, but having, a rough outline of what we want to do. I think, at least from my end. And I think yours too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And as always, we're not trying to in any way tell you where to go with it. We're trying to sort of give you some ideas as well as outline kind of what the point of it might be or what you might want to try to go for with it, while not trying to at all enforce one way or the other for you to actually, do with it.
Yeah, just kind of rough guidelines rather than actual rules, as Barbosa would put it. Anyway, what's the Reddit question for this week, John?
So remember last week how I forgot to make a Reddit question?
I do remember that.
It's a lot like that.
It's a lot like that. Okay, that makes sense.
And by a lot, I mean just like that. So I imagine like there's one person in like Germany or something who spent all their waking, hours waiting for the Reddit question to happen, and I let them down. I know that didn't actually happen anywhere in the world, and I don't know why I picked Germany, but
because we only have 4 listeners in Germany.
I think, yeah. But anyway, no, there's no Reddit question because I am a horrible, awful person who can't do anything that they say they're going to do.
Well, speaking of Germany, though, and just Europe and listeners in general, we had a...
Speaking of Germany, and by Germany I mean Europe.
It's all the same thing, right? Well, it's very, very American of me. No.
Oh, gosh.
No, I love Europe. I love the individual countries in Europe and all the different cultures.
You mean Europe?
Same thing. No. We had a weird bump in listenership from Finland, which was super cool. I knew some Finnish people when I went to orchestra camp in Colorado about 13 years ago. Wow, man.
Long time ago.
I met several people from there, and they were awesome. And so I wanted to say at the beginning of the episode, but I forgot, welcome in Finnish, which is tervetuloa or something like that. I'm saying it very Italian, I'm sure, but
Tervetuloa.
tervetuloa. I don't know if you roll your R's or not. It's a very interesting language that I remember learning a few words in and forgetting from back then, but I looked that one up on Google.
Vito vetoed my idea of saying hello by doing my impression of the Swedish chef, which is wrong in a number of levels, but I just want you guys to know what you're being deprived of.
We have to have some standards here on the podcast, John.
Some standards.
Even if
we can't
low.
spend the whole episode talking about religion and then do a
super...
Swedish chef impersonation.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't do both. It's one or the other.
We have to be sophisticated. Okay. All right. Anyway.
And yes, I understand that Sweden is not Finland. That's part of the joke. Just to be clear.
Actually, it's very interesting. You guys should all look up the history of Finland because it's a very interesting, completely different people group, completely different language, and very little in common with a lot of the other nations around it. Very interesting. Anyway.
Speaking of Finland, you guys should look up the history of Finland.
There's just definitely that. Pushing up my glasses on my nose. Okay. Anyway. Anyway, look out this week for hopefully a Reddit question, I guess.
Yes, I'm going to make one.
Cool.
Trademark, going to make one. It hasn't been reliable thus far.
It'll work this time.
You know what? It's been perfectly reliable until the last 2 weeks. I'm not gonna die on this topic.
Cool. Anyway, like I said, I'm gonna have a little more time this week to work on things. Hopefully, you will too, and we'll get back to it next week.
Indeed.
In
the meantime, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at World Builders Anonymous. You can email us with your questions or comments or criticisms at WBA_podcast. No, just WBApodcast@gmail.com.
No underscore.
No underscore. There is an underscore in our Reddit handle, and we'll probably be doing the question on the world building. Is it world building or world builders Reddit page? Oh, gosh.
World building, I think.
Okay, let's go with that. The question will be up on there.
I know all about Reddit, John.
Yes, as we know, Vito is the authority on Reddit. How do you spell Reddit, Vito?
REDDDDDDIT.
Perfect. So, yeah, look for me on there, WBA_podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can leave us a review on iTunes and give us a 5-star review and subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support us even further, you can find our affiliate Audible link on our website and purchase some super cool audiobooks.
Which I just updated, by the way, for the audiobook we just finished listening to, which is by Jeff Wheeler, who we are hoping might be on the podcast at some point. We will see if we can make that happen.
And speaking of alternate podcast appearances, we will be hanging out with the folks at Beyond the Trope coming up here on Saturday. Not sure when the episode is going to air, but it will air at some point, and we will let you know when it does. Go ahead and go listen to their podcast. They're great. The people over there.
Again, Beyond the Trope.
Beyond the Trope. They're great people. Talk about a bunch of nerdy stuff, including science fiction and fantasy, as well as a whole host of other things, including anime and all kinds of stuff. So some good folks over there. Go ahead and support them as well.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think that just wraps it up for today. Thanks for listening. We will see you next week.
Goodbye.
This show is sponsored in part by Audible. Visit worldbuildersanonymous.com/audible to check out what the guys are listening to right now and to receive a free audiobook.